Hello everyone, Dan Harvey here, and we'll begin by giving a shout out to the nice people at Videvo, where I've got most of my footage today. Some great stock, free stock footage and royalty-free footage available from those guys. I'll begin by taking a deep dive into Cornerpin Studio, which is the headline feature for Continuum 2020. So the goal here is to do a little bit of set dressing. We've got some modern signage in something that we might want to make a little bit more old-fashioned. So in V1 we've got our background plate, and in V2 we've got our foreground plate that we want to pin into the background. So I'll go to V2, open the Continuum match move unit and select Cornerpin Studio and drag that to the V2 track on my timeline, and show the effect controls for this layer. And you can see now that it's initialized in its default state. Here we can see the 4 corner pin handles for the layer. One thing I'm going to do here is just open up the transforms here and show those, and we're going to move those into position so that we can align it. If I open up the composite controls here, I'm going to help myself by making that semi-transparent just for the moment so that I can see behind the layer that I'm pinning in and see the corners that I want to attach it to. So now I'll make that fully opaque again. And now obviously you want this to follow the action on the background. Well, I've got the composite mode open here. There are a bunch of different apply modes available here if we want to do some deep compositing, but I just want to blend that over the top. So at the bottom, we see the ubiquitous motion tracker Mocha option. I'll twirl that open. This is now available in a lot of the tools that enable us to move our layers around, and we can change our offsets and so on here. Just reset that to 0. The key thing here is the motion tracker, launch Mocha motion tracker option here. So if I check that, this opens the Mocha UI in a floating window. So here we can see the layer that I'm tracking, and if I just zoom in here with the Z key and drag, you can see the foreground object and a couple of different things to look at here. So I'll just turn off the surface tool. You'll note that there's a shape of the corner pin automatically aligned around the area, just with a little bit of breathing room with the soft corners. If I move the corner position for each vertex, that aligns it with a feature that I want to track. I'm going to keep fairly tight to this this foreground object, and the corner handles on the outside here allow me to change the tension on the spline through the vertex there by dragging on that. If I right click and drag, that will adjust the tension on all of the vertices. I'll just click here to deselect all of the vertices and just align those closely with the area of interest. Now when I show the second object, I'll just hide the shape overlay for the moment. The second overlay is the surface overlay, and this is a visualization of the 4-corner track, which will be derived from analyzing the motion of the pixels inside the shape area. So now I'm going to go ahead and track forward, and I forgot to enable perspective there. See, that's a little bit of drift because I didn't enable perspective. I was only tracking translation, scale, and rotation. So if I enable perspective now, you'll see that holds on a lot better as we move through the timeline. And we save that down. You'll see now that the foreground object is tracked over the background. So I've started off fairly simple. There are no occlusions or no foreground objects in the way to interfere with this track. We're going to move on to something a little bit more challenging in the next example. In this example, I want to track something into the green area of the laptop here. What I want to track in is the Continuum page of our web shop on our website here, and a bit of a challenge because there's something in the way of the foreground. The talent's hand is moving around. So that's going to introduce a couple of issues. We're going to have to keep that over the background, and we'll also have to do a little bit of work to ensure that the foreground occlusion doesn't interfere with our track. So once again, I'll add Corner Pin Studio to my timeline segment, V2. And once again, it initializes in its default position. So if we select that layer and open the effect controls for that layer, I can start positioning my corners. So now I'll position my first 3 corners. I can't see my 3rd corner, so I'm going to use the edges of the laptop screen just as a guide to roughly place that in position. Worth a little bit of a line at the top of the screen there, where there's a little bit of unwanted detail. If I jump into the source pins here, we can control the source pin area. You see this moving around on the background. So this is basically determining what area of the source is attached to the corner pins that I track in. If I choose to crop to source pins, I'm just going to move that down. So now I'm cropping using the source pins to remove the unwanted picture detail. So this is, if something's not exactly the right shape, we can crop into it using this workflow. So now I'm going to use the top right pin and just crop into that a little bit. And now we've removed that annoying line at the top of the screen. So now I've got a rough position for my 4 corners. I'm going to jump into the motion tracker, the Mocha motion tracker, and begin tracking. As I said, this is going to be a little bit of a challenge because of the foreground occlusion. So I'll right click and drag to set the size of the shape that's going to be used to derive the track. I'm going to use the edges of the laptop bezel here, because that gives me a good area to track. And just align that roughly. I'm going to have a bit of a problem with her waving her hand about here, so I'm going to take care of that by drawing a foreground mask to hold this out. I'm going to choose the magnetic spline tool here. Magnetic spline tool works in a couple of ways. You can either automatically get it to trace an edge, but I'm just going to hold the left mouse button down and drag and use this just like a pen and draw the shape around here. Now when I want to close the shape, right click to close the shape. So I just want to roughly animate this roto around the foreground occlusion. So I'll move forward in time a little bit. You'll note that the A button here is lit up, is highlighted. That means that it's in auto key mode. So when I make a change to any of the parameters, in this case by moving the bounding box for the foreground shape, I create a keyframe, and each time I make a change on the timeline, another keyframe is inserted as indicated by these little green triangles on the timeline. So just roughly roto my foreground object, And now we'll take a look at the layer stacking order. So our corner pins object is here, and our foreground occlusion object is below it currently in the stacking order. If I move it above the corner pins object, this will act as a holdout. Just to show this, I'm going to enable show layer mats, and when I press and hold on the little triangle here, this will show me the various options. So that just shows you the current mat or the selected track mat. You see what's highlighted here in white is the area that the tracker will be looking at when it measures the track. And as you can see, because layer 2 is above it in the stacking order, it cuts a hole or a boolean into that to ensure that none of the pixels in the area of the hand will be considered when the track is measured. In a nutshell, whatever's nearest to the camera should be furthest up the tracking order when you're tracking in Mocha. And because I've already animated that hand, I don't need to track it. So the cogwheel indicates whether a layer is going to be tracked. I'm not going to track layer 2. I am going to track layer 1. This time I'm going to leave perspective off because it's just a sort of lateral camera move. I don't need to track perspective. And I'm going to go ahead and track. And that's holding on reasonably well. I expect a little bit of drift down here because this corner is obscured by the hand. So if it does drift, we're going to look at some strategies to refine our track once we've measured it. A little bit of drift up at the top here. So I'm going to wind back and take a look at a tool that will enable us to refine tracks that are problematic, and that's the Adjust Track tool here. The Adjust Track tool allows us to overlay another set of keyframes on top of our tracking keyframes to modify the track or to correct it. What I'm going to do here is hit Set Master All. This sets the initial keyframe for the surface area. I'm going to go ahead and hide the shape overlay for the moment and move forward to a frame where there's some drift occurring. Grab hold of the corner of the surface area, and you'll see the green outline showing me the new location that I'm moving to. And you'll notice in the top left of the preview window is a detailed zoomed in view. This is the zoom view to enable me to ensure that I'm placing my my new keyframe in exactly the right place. I'll also make that change for the bottom left-hand corner, and as I drag through now, you'll see my track has been corrected for the drift caused by the little bit of occlusion in the foreground. So now I'm going to go ahead and save that down, exit back to Mocha, back to Avid, sorry, and my track's pretty good, but now I've got a challenge because I want to key out my foreground object. So pretty easy to do this. If I just move my foreground object up to the next layer, so now my tracked foreground is behind the background, I can just key into that. And if I want to key, there's a great tool in the Continuum tool set for that. Another one of the studio tools, which is Primat Studio. So I'm going to open Primat Studio effect controls, and we see here the head-up display, which gives us the most useful, most commonly used tools within the Primat Studio toolset. What I'm going to do here is manually sample the background using a point selection. So I'm just going to trace around an area where my background color is to be keyed out. That gives me a rough key, but I'll probably need to refine that. So if I display the matte status view, this gives me a high contrast visualization of my matte. shows me very clearly what's semi-transparent and what's opaque in the matte. So now I'll change my mode with my picker to clean background. This will enable me to select either with a point selection or rectangular marquee selection areas that I want to be completely transparent in my matte. Likewise for the foreground, see the green plants are a little bit close to the green color of the green screen on the laptop here. They're being keyed out. So if I go to clean foreground and sample these, I can make sure that they're not keyed out. And if I look at the final composite, now we're starting to get into the ballpark. Now I'm going to use my clean background with the point sampler and just take a little bite out of the foreground colors here. And just to refine that a little bit more, I'm going to turn on the light wrap. So this is going to use the background color, or in this case, our corner pinned foreground, to color correct the edges of the composite. If I go into edge color correction and enable that, I'm just going to twirl that open and bring up the brightness of the edges a little bit just to finish that off. So I'll scrub through and you'll see that now I've composited my foreground over the corner pin background. So moving on to something yet more challenging, what I want to do here is to replace the billboard in Piccadilly Circus here, and a perfect storm of problems for match moving here. We've got motion blur and we've got foreground occlusion of the area that I want to track. So a few workarounds required here. The way that I've organized my layers is slightly different from the normal workflow. I've placed my background on V1, my foreground on V1 and my background on V2. This is because I want to use a different workflow in Corner Pin Studio. So I'm going to place Corner Pin Studio on the V2 track and open the effect controls. And in previous examples, I was using the apply to foreground workflow. So my foreground was the V2 layer, and I tracked that and I measured the track off the background. This time I want to reverse that. The reason for that is because I want to get access to an additional Mocha tool, which is exposed in the background workflow. So I'm going to select apply to background. Now it's asking me to select a foreground layer. So my foreground layer is the first below. So basically I'm working in reverse. And now that I'm in the apply to background workflow, I also have the Pixel Chooser Mocha tool available for drawing masks for foreground occlusions, because obviously I can't key this out. So I'll begin by launching Mocha to begin the tracking. Before I do that, I'll just align. I'll pick a frame where I can see all of the area that I want to track. So I need to track backwards and forwards to complete that. So I'll place my corners for my foreground object. And that's the area that I want to fill. Now I need to track it. So I'm going to launch into Mocha. And as before, our corner pin area is defined by the surface tool, and the area for the shape where I'm going to measure the track is defined by the shape here. So right click and drag to get hard edges on the corners, and I'll pull that in so that it's analyzing the area that I want to track. I'm going to use the middle mouse button and drag just to pan. I can also use the X hotkey to pan. so I can see outside of the screen area. So this is my kind of my starting point for tracking. Now, my tracking is not going to get very far when this ambulance gets in the way, so I need to do a similar thing to what I did in the previous example. I'll also need to use the same shape to hold that out in the final composite. So this time I'm just going to make a very rough X-spline tool around this shape, around the ambulance. So I don't need to cover the whole ambulance, just the bit that's occluding my foreground. So something like that. And once again, auto key is on. So I'll move my points around. Because of the motion blur, I don't need to be super accurate with this. That's one advantage of the motion blur. And just roughly roto out this foreground area. And as in the previous example, when I've completed drawing my shape, I'll place that above the area that I want to track, so as to ensure that it's is held out during the tracking analysis. So I'll take layer 2 and place this up above my corner pins track. I don't want to process layer 2, and I'm going to go back to my initial keyframe here. I'll enable perspective tracking because this is a perspective move. I'll increase the number of pixels used for tracking. Note that I'm still working in proxy mode in Avid, so I'm actually only looking at half of the picture detail, but that's probably going to be adequate to achieve a decent track. Sometimes we'll need to turn this to full resolution to use all of the pixels in the image. So I'm going to start tracking forward, and that holds reasonably well, and track backwards. And if I turn on my perspective grid just to test that, that's a pretty good track considering all of the motion blur and all the other problems. So I'm going to save that down and exit back to the Avid timeline, and now we can see my move. Now, of course, we want to get the ambulance out of the way. So this is where the second instance of Mocha comes in to play in the background workflow, the apply to background workflow. I'm going to launch into Mocha, and if I twirl open the effect trackers here, you'll see that it's remembered all of the work that I've done in this session. I don't want to use the corner pins layer in my composition, so I'm going to hide that. Okay, I only want to use the layer for the ambulance. I'm going to select that, and with my Uber key enabled, because I want to modify all of the keyframes. I've got a number of keyframes on this shape, and this will modify all of them. I'm going to set the edge width a little bit softer, just to soften that edge a little bit. I'll save that down. Well, before I do, I'll invert that because I want to apply my mask to everything but the ambulance. So save that down and exit back to the Avid timeline, and you'll see now that my ambulance shape is cutting a hole in the foreground. So we're making progress, but a little bit of further refinement, masses of motion blur on the background, and a sharp foreground. So this is where the benefit of the full studio tool set becomes apparent, because we've got a bunch of tools here that we can refine our composition with, beginning with color correction. So if I enable the color correction tool, I can just punch up the brightness a little bit more contrast. And next, I'll enable light wrap and soften the edge of the area and increase the width of the light wrap just to bring some of that ambient light into the foreground to make that sit into the composition a little bit more convincingly. And finally, in the render options, I can enable motion blur. So I'll turn on motion blur, change the shutter angle to match the shutter angle of the live action camera. I can decrease or increase the number of samples used to render the motion blur, and there's my final composition. So there's the benefit of having the full suite of tools available within Corner Pin Studio for a range of tasks, from simple screen replacement to set dressing and more advanced compositing tasks. So moving on, in the next example, we're going to take a look at the reflection tool. In my V1 track, I've got my background plate, and in the V2 track, I've got a simple Avid title. So there's my composition, and I'd like to add a little bit of depth to this. So I'm going to go into the Continuum Stylize group and find the BCC reflection tool. I'm going to drag this onto a filler layer above to affect the overall composition. So BCC reflection goes into the filler layer, and that will be applied with its default settings. If I just enable the filler layer, now we can see the reflection in its default position. So if I work with my image plane, first of all, now you can see how that's working. I'm increasing the size of the image, and you can see because I've unlocked it from the reflection, if I lock it to the reflection and change its scale, so the reflection is also affected. So if I unlock that, I want to affect the orientation of the reflection independently. So if I come down to the reflection plane here, I can now change the position of where the reflection plane begins. So at the moment that's just kind of two-dimensional. So if I now rotate the reflection plane in the x-axis, drag on this, now we get something a little bit more three-dimensional. And if I now go to the built-in camera for the effect, I can change the camera zoom or dolly and the camera orientation. So you can see that that's a true 3D effect. Moving on to a slightly more complex example here, my background plate, and here we have a logo with an alpha channel. So we have the matte key effect applied in the Avid timeline. So once again, I'm going to select Continuum Reflection and apply that to the layer with the matte key. And you should see something rather unexpected happen there. Because this is a matte key, we need to tell the reflection tool to obey the key. And this is where the title matte option applies. So if I twirl open title matte and say apply to title matte, now the reflection is applied to the area within the matte. Once again, I'm going to unlock the reflection plane and change the Y point of the reflection plane so that that's aligned. And once again, I'm going to rotate that around. And that's kind of the rough alignment that I want. I'm just going to change the opacity a little bit. Now I'll close the reflection plane and take a look at the reflection style options here. So the softness is how blurred the reflection is. And to simulate depth of field, we can change the Y ratio to determine when that blurring fades in and out. We can also change the the fade. So if I change the fade, you can see that that kind of blends off with a gradient. So something like that as a starting point. And for an added layer of realism, I'm going to enable ripple. So I'm going to turn up the ripple amount, and a procedural ripple filter is applied to the reflection. I'll change the x-axis scaling for that. As we scroll through, you'll see that the ripple is now distorting the reflection layer. So now I want to do a little bit of an animation to reveal this logo. So I'm going to go back to the image plane properties here. If I move the Y point around, you'll see that that crops off. So I want to do a little bit of keyframing here. So I'll set the initial position. I'm going to open the keyframe controls just by expanding that window a little bit, and use the keyframe timeline. And I'm going to set in the Y point keyframe timeline a keyframe. Right click in the Avid effect menu to add that keyframe. So there's my Y point keyframe. And go a little bit forward in time, right click again, add another keyframe, and now adjust the Y point so that it disappears. So now our logo is animating off with its reflection. So very handy for a 2D host like Avid, where we can add another layer of three-dimensionality and another layer of realism to our compositions. I'm going to close Avid now and take a look at another new 3D tool for Continuum 2020, this time in Adobe After Effects. So here we have this is actually a 3D composition in After Effects, but I'm just going to start kind of in 2D mode, just to show how we can work with the built-in or host cameras and lights, depending on whether the host is a 3D host or a 2D host. So I'm going to go into my effects tools for my layer with the logo. So this is my logo with an alpha channel. And I'm going to choose from the stylize group BCC cast shadow. And when I change the light position, now you'll see the cast shadow in the background here. I'll just move the light a little bit to the right. And now I'm going to jump into the built-in light controls and set the fill color for the shadow, get a little bit of a bolder shadow. And now you can see the behavior of the built-in light and how that affects the composition. There's also a built-in camera. So if I go to the built-in camera and tilt that on its axis, you'll see that the view on the layer only is affected. But this, as I said before, this is a 3D composition. So I'm going to enable, as you can see, all of the 3 layers here. These are 3D, defined as 3D layers in After Effects. So if I enable the After Effects camera and lights, now when I orbit my camera, C for the camera tool in After Effects, you can see that that's a 3D composition. So if I go into the cast shadow tool and say I would like to use the comp camera and comp lights, once again I can set the fill color for the shadow on the comp light, V for the select tool. Now I'm moving the After Effects native light around, and that's lighting the scene, and it's also casting the shadow in the Continuum cast shadow effect. If I hit C again to dolly my camera, rotate my camera, now you can see that I'm working in true 3D with this effect. So depending on whether the host is a 2D host, you have the benefit of the built-in cameras and lights. In a 3D host like After Effects, we can work with the native cameras and lights. So moving on, we have Title Studio applied here to this layer. So if I open the effect controls for that, this is the default setting for Title Studio, types Boris FX in a simple embossed text format, just as a placeholder. If I open the effects browser, we'll see that one of the things that's new in 2020 is a vast array of new presets. So just picking a few at random, using the new pixel-based shaders for volumetric lighting effects. Reveals and so on. A bunch of cool new presets to choose from. Obviously, once you've chosen a preset, you can then apply that and then jump into advanced mode and start adding your own text. So if we go into the text here and select our layer, we can start typing over that. And then that will be applied with the settings. So I'm just going to exit from here, and what I'll do here is just add the default preset and now launch into the UI and take a look at some of the other new tools. So if we go in here and add some new extruded text, and we'll get rid of that one. So there's my extruded text. There are a bunch of new materials available here. So for example, metallic textures. I'm going to use the transform controls. I can select the transform controls here, or with the shortcuts W, E, and R. I can scale, rotate, and orient, so we can now see the reflection maps. So if we go in here to, for example, our animated liquid textures, bunch of cool new textures and effects, also shaders. Particular favorite of mine, the linear 2D ripple, pretty psychedelic, and a bunch of 2D shaders and 3D shaders. Also, in 2020, we have improved the integration with Cinema 4D. If I choose to load a 3D model file, pretty big model here, and we'll load that in. This is authored in Maxon Cinema 4D, and I use the transform widget, and you'll see that this complex model with all of its materials, textures, and so on is imported natively into the 3D workspace for Title Studio. If I go to the scene settings here and look at the lighting controls, this will integrate, the imported model will integrate with the built-in lights and so on. So if I go to the scene controls and select the lights option here, now I can start moving around with the built-in lights and light that as required. So I'm just going to exit from there. And not letting me exit for some reason. Probably the perils of running multiple applications on my my little old MacBook Pro, 5-year-old MacBook Pro, possibly run out of memory there. So I'm going to move on to the next example. And take a look at resolve. So, oh, I think it's caught up with me. So moving on to Blackmagic Resolve. I'm in the timeline here with, and oh, here's After Effects again. We'll get there in the end. Oh, what's After Effects say? It's caught up with me. Fantastic. Moving on to Resolve. So here's in Resolve, I've got a timeline with a bunch of different shots. If I go to the edit point between these two shots at the beginning of the timeline, you'll see that there's a green highlight to indicate that there are handles on this outgoing shot, handles on the incoming shot. So that means I can add a transition. So in my OFX transitions group here, I can see all of the continuum transitions. So what I'm going to add here is the curl dissolve tool. So I'll apply that here. Just trim the transition length out a little bit. And as we go through, you'll see a kind of a warp effect in the dissolve. Now, if I switch back to After Effects, now that it's now After Effects has woken up, if I could switch back to the project here and take a look at this example, the curl dissolve effect is basically the transition implementation of the curl filter, which is new for Continuum 2020. So I've got a couple of layers in my composition, my background plate and my logo. So if I select my background plate and apply from the warp group the new curl transition, here it is with its default setting. So this is the curl size, the two main parameters. You can see these little curly Q effects. So we can, ranging from simulating water drops on windows or glass to more kind of esoteric effects like heat hazes and so on. If I increase the amplitude and the size, you get something more freaky. So something like that, and this is procedurally animated as well. So as I scrub through the timeline, you'll see that that's moving around. So that's affecting the background. So if I now go to the foreground and select my foreground plate and also apply the same effect to that, so apply the curl effect and turn up the amplitude and increase the size a little bit. And I'm going to keyframe the amplitude so that we start with something very warped, and then 10 seconds into the shot, we'll bring that down to 0 so that it's normal. So this kind of acts as a kind of a psychedelic reveal for our effect. So if we go in here and turn that up, you can see the result. So moving on to Blackmagic Resolve, basically the same tool is applied as a transition. So in the middle of the transition, it reaches its peak intensity and then fades off. To visualize this, I'm going to double click on the transition segment, go to the Open Effects Inspector, and here we can see the controls for the curl effect, so the complexity and the amplitude and so on. And this is part right in the middle of the transition, so this is the peak the effect. If we want to visualize the animation a little more graphically, we can open up the animation tuning controls and show the ease curve. And so this is the duration of the clip. At the moment, the effect duration is only 60% of the clip. So if we increase that, the start time is earlier. And this is the beginning, and it eases into the middle keyframe, then eases back out towards the end. If we change the ease middle, this will be like a linear transition into the middle of the animation. And if we relax that a little bit, we can also change the ease in. So basically a time curve and the ease out. So it's very easy to visualize the timing of the effect. So one of the new tools, one of 6 new transition tools in Continuum 2020. The second is Prism Dissolve. So this gives us a kind of prismatic blur where you basically apply a different weighting to the RGB channels. Nice kind of chromatic aberration type of effect. Once again, if I double click on that and go to the Open Effects inspector, here we can see the different colors. So if I want to choose a different color to fill the blur and hit OK for that. So we can choose different colors and different sample amounts to get more of a strobing effect or more of a smooth crash zoom effect or whatever. And we'll take a look at another little refinement which is often overlooked in all of the Continuum transitions, which is the region animation. So we'll go down here. At the moment, the animation type is set to none. So that just applies it uniformly. If I go in here and say I would like to apply an out curve to that, you'll see that it's animating the clip in and out within a region. If I just take the softness off that, you'll see clearly the region that I'm talking about. This is a circular region, or we can use a linear region, and we can change its direction. So now you can see how the region animation is coming into play. All of these refinements available in all of the transition tools. The next new transition for Continuum 2020 is the RGB blur transition. So here we've got a blur in the y-axis, and if we open the inspector, we can see how the weighting is applied to the different channels, to the red, the green, and the blue. So if we just turn down the master blur a little bit, it just looks like a more subtle kind of chromatic aberration type of a blur. Next new transition is the kaleidoscope transition. This breaks the image up into a kind of matrix of intersecting shapes. And if we open the inspector, we can edit the distortion and so on. So it's got a psychedelic one. And moving on to the next one, RGB displacement. This applies a luminance-based displacement, and this can affect the RGB channels independently. Once again, I open the inspector. If I disable the misalignment, that's just like a regular displacement transition, or if I use the disalignment, then I can change the intensity of how the different channels are displaced by luminance. Another nice psychedelic effect. And lastly, I think, oh no, there's 2 more. Lastly is the RGB colorized glow. effect. So this is basically applying a kind of luminance-based glow to our clips. If we open the inspector, I turn down the glow opacity. This is basically triggering off a threshold. So if I decrease the threshold, then it will be only triggering off the brightest highlights. If I bring it down, it will be triggering off the grays. And this is mapping colors based on our color pickers here. So if I choose, for example, the yellow color, change that to blue, now you can see that that level of luminance is remapped to blue in the middle of the transition. So 6 new transitions, part of the additional tools in Continuum 2020. And lastly, I'm going to take a look at grading with Resolve using Mocha masks. So I'm just going to go to my edit page and choose the timeline. We'll also take a look at the workflow for using Mocha masks in Resolve, which is slightly different from some of the other hosts. What I've done here is place my layer that I want to mask on V1 and V2. And I'm going to open the node tree in Resolve for the V2 track. So I'm going to search here for the pixel chooser and drag that to the current node on the V2 track. So this is the default behavior of the pixel chooser. So if we now go to the output settings, the reason why I'm seeing a black and white matte is because it's outputting a black and white matte. The reason it's outputting a black and white matte is because the pixel chooser matte is reading from the Luma channel. If I say don't read from the Luma channel, ignore the Luma channel, now my matte is open. If I choose not to output a black and white matte, but an alpha channel, now my white matte is revealing the same clip on V1. What I want to do is draw a mask to change the color of the sunglasses. The problem I have here is that tracking this, even with a powerful planar tracker like Mocha, is going to be problematic because the way the reflection has a different parallax to the area that I want to track. So I need to track the rim of the sunglasses, which is quite a complex area. And it would be quite time consuming to draw the shapes using conventional spline drawing tools. So I'm going to open Mocha and launch into Mocha Mask Track and take a look at a new tool for Mocha 2020 and its little brother in the integrated Mocha tools in Continuum 2020, and that's the Area Brush tool. So what the Area Brush tool allows us to do is to simply paint using a pressure sensitive pen or mouse an area, and then this is converted instantly to a spline. I'm going to undo that because I want to refine this a little bit. I'm going to enable the quick mask mode, and I'm going to use the open and close square brackets keyboard shortcut to change the size of the brush, and I'm going to start drawing around the area of interest. And you'll notice now that when I release my mouse, it doesn't complete the shape. So what this allows me to do is draw multiple shapes before committing my results. So I'm only using a mouse here, so it's not super accurate. I'm going to refine it by holding the Alt key and drawing. This allows me to erase an area. So go in here and erase, and then once again make that a little bit smaller, and that's kind of the area that I want to track. Now when I disable quick mask, that drawing is now converted to a mask shape. Now, I want to apply the motion that I analyze within the rims of the glasses to a more accurate shape in the lenses of the glasses. So I'm just going to hide that for a moment. I'm going to use another tool here, which is, this is new in the last version of Mocha. This is the magnetic spline tool. If I click with the mouse and then move my mouse, it's automatically detecting the edges. So it's a really useful tool for roto. When there's not enough contrast, as you can see here, I can hold the mouse down and paint. So using a combination of those, right click to close, I can draw an accurate shape around a region of interest. I'm going to go in here and select add new shape to spline and repeat that for the second lens. Once again, I'm going to draw around the bottom where there's not enough contrast to work with, and then automatically trace the edges. So now my second spline consists of two shapes. Now, this is an important workflow in Mocha, which is kind of a linking one layer to another layer. So at the moment, layer 3, which is the lens, is linked to its own tracker. Lens is linked to lens. I want this to link to the rim layer. So we'll call that rim just for clarity. So we're going to link lens to rim. And we're going to choose not to process the lens because that's going to follow what the rim is doing. Okay, so if we go ahead and track, being mindful of the time here, I'm just going to stop halfway through. I'm going to hide the rim shape, and you'll notice now that the tracking that was measured on the rim is now applied to the lens. Very important workflow in Mocha. You don't have to track the area that or the shape that you want to track. You can track something that actually tracks properly and then apply that to the problematic area. So I'm going to save that down, and now it's cut my foreground area out over nothing. If I right click here and say I would like to add an alpha output and connect that alpha output, and right click in the node and say use OFX alpha, I'm now using the alpha from the pixel chooser to cut a hole in my foreground and reveal the same clip behind it. If I twirl open the pixel chooser mask, I can feather that edge a little bit to soften it, and now I can use the native color grading tools within Resolve to grade my foreground. As I scrub through the timeline, you'll see that what I've tracked is following the track that I painted with the quick mask tool. So where conventional trackers fail, point trackers and host trackers, we can now use the power of Mocha's award-winning planar tracker and the additional magnetic shape tools and painting tools to obtain a track where other trackers fail. So that concludes my presentation. If you have any questions, I will refer you to Peter and Jesse. Thanks for your time, and have a good weekend.
Okay, thanks, Dan. That was awesome. Before I swap it over to Peter, I just want to quickly announce who the raffle winners are. Congratulations to George Green, who has won the 1-year Avid Media Composer subscription. Congratulations to Emily Chang, Forrest Brennan, Jacqueline Matthews, Nick Adamczyk, and Julia Fott, who have each won a $200 gift certificate to Action VFX. Congratulations to Inga Olzina Joule, who has won the Boris FX 1-year bundle. Congratulations to Christopher Ray, who has won the 1-year Continuum subscription. Congratulations to Leighton Peterson, who has won the 1-year Sapphire subscription. And congratulations to August Malaysia. sorry if I said that wrong, who has won the 1-year Mocha Pro subscription. And Peter, I'm going to pass it off to you now.
Well, thank you, Jesse, and thank you, Dan. Dan, I just want to say thanks for sharing your tips and techniques with everybody and for showing all the new features, filters, and transitions that are included in Continuum 2020. Amazing stuff. Thank you so much. Thanks to our wonderful Director of Marketing, Jesse, for organizing the event and answering all those sales-related questions. And thanks for all of you for taking the time to sit in this webinar with us. Sincerely hope you learned a lot today, and that Dan's excellent training will help you with your projects, sequences, and comps. He's a great artist. I just love working with Dan. Anyway, don't want to take too much more of your time. We're over our limit. So just thanks again and enjoy these new tools. Bye, folks.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Bye.